Kia ora koutou katoa. He mihi mahana tēnei kia koutou. I'm just balancing on this rock because I'm only 5 foot, so you could see me, and so all of those perhaps in the Australian High Commission could also see me. In the early 2000s I spent some time in a community called Freegon, which is a remote Aboriginal community about 3 hours south of Uluru Ayers Rock in Central Australia. Lived there in the community Freegon and then out in one of the homelands, Chichimburi. That's Anangu, Pitjantjatjara, Yankunytjatjara land. To access that land you need a permit to get on there, and then you're there basically as their guest. It's their land. And I think that provides one of the contextual issues to this whole matter. In those places they're protecting their sovereignty and have a level of guardianship and ownership that others want to take away. We're here clearly all today to stop the closures of these remote communities. We're here to show our solidarity and to try and sway some of the politicians that are making decisions about these closures. But how are we going to convince them to change their minds? How are we going to convince New Zealand politicians and Australian politicians to change their minds? And I think there are a number of arguments that we could put forward, but I want to talk about 3 in particular. The first one is we could present them with a human rights argument and the facts about the breaches of different United Nations conventions and declarations that they're about to make. We have the Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples, for example. Article 26 of that particular declaration says that Indigenous peoples have the right to own, use and develop their own lands. Article 3 says that Indigenous peoples have the right to develop their culture. Article 18, the right to participate in decisions affecting their rights. And Article 3, the right to self-determination, of course. So there are those kinds of human rights that are being breached. The actions of the Western Australian government also clearly breaches conventions relating to eliminating racial discrimination. There's only one particular group, ethnic group, that's being affected here. That's racial discrimination, i.e. racism. So there are those breaches. The UN and Amnesty International have also written about these closures of communities breaching provisions relating to adequate housing. So we've got a human rights argument we could present to sway people. The second argument we could present is an economic one. Western Australia is the richest Australian state. Can they really not redistribute a tiny proportion of that wealth to support the people who they acquired, took up, stole that land from? Can they not redistribute a tiny portion? Could they not encourage mining companies that are depleting resources and destroying the land there to carve off a tiny proportion of their enormous profits, including some of those which come from tax breaks and subsidies, which are subsidising their lifestyle choices, to provide the basics for the people of that land? And we're talking about basic services for those people. We're not talking about luxury swimming pools or golf courses or that kind of thing. We're talking about basic services. Can they also not imagine that further supporting community development through renewable energy initiatives, such as installing, say, solar panels in an area which is very hot and sunny, might also support those communities and make economic sense? In 2012, the Australian government did invest $40 million in an Indigenous energy program. Can't Western Australian governments pick that up and extend that to their communities? Including people in the construction and maintenance of small-scale energy production provides jobs and electricity to support those communities. The third argument we could present to politicians to sway them on this is perhaps a moral one. At present, we're told that one of the key justifications for being involved in wars in faraway places like Iraq is that New Zealanders are needed to protect innocent lives. Well, if New Zealand politicians are really concerned about protecting innocent lives, then let's start a little closer to home. Let's start in our own region. Let's deploy our energy and resources and personnel to pressure the Australian government to stop the genocidal treatment of Aboriginal peoples and their communities. Do New Zealand politicians want to be remembered for standing up for those in their own backyard who are being marginalised and kicked out of the communities? Those are laudable and lofty goals. Or do they want to be remembered for pulling people's ponytails? At the heart of this issue is also a political game between the federal and state government, with Tony Abbott's government slashing more than $500 million from federal spending on Indigenous social programs and not wanting to restore it, and the Western Australian state government not wanting to chip in. So it's a game that they're playing here. But innocent people should not be the victims of other people's games and wars, lest we forget. Australian politicians and decision makers need to go and talk to Aboriginal communities, support their aspirations and their right to their own communities and futures. Makes human rights, economic and moral sense.
Kia ora. Kia ora, our next speaker is Hone Harawira. He's pretty short, so he might need this rock too.
Good everybody. Look, I don't need to send a message to these guys in here. Your presence sends that message. But the message I have is more for us than it is for them. And it's this. While I support what it is that we're doing here to oppose the closure of remote communities in Western Australia, don't forget that the governments that we have in this country are also closing remote communities right here, right now. Māori people here will know of communities up and down the country where if you try to move back home because the dole isn't enough to live on in the city, you go back to your community, they cut your dole. That's their way of closing remote communities right here in this country. So I expect Māori to be up in support of our cousins across the ditch because we have exactly the same problems right here. I want to meet to our brother, our Ngāpuhi brother, Te Mana Tahu. Thought I'd slip in the Ngāpuhi while Moki was here. And all of those who stood up, our sister Bella Bofo and others who've been arrested for daring to stand up for their communities, for keeping their communities open across there in Western Australia. I want to speak in support of all of those Indigenous leaders all around the Pacific for doing exactly the same thing. For those who are currently in New York at the United Nations People's Forum on Indigenous Issues, who have put this kaupapa on the table at the United Nations, because unless we all stand together, particularly the Indigenous peoples of the world, every other colonialist prick, including the pricks in this place over here, are going to think they can get away with the same thing. So, as we march in solidarity with our brothers and sisters over there, remember when the time comes, I expect to see us all marching in solidarity with our brothers and sisters right here. It goes back to the Springbok tour, when the police said to us, what are you guys all turning out for? Fighting apartheid in South Africa? We said, hell no, not just for that. We're doing it to fight racism here as well. And if we can localize the issue and understand what it means to us here in this country, it makes it easier for us to understand what it means to our brothers and sisters over there. For those who done these little placards here, naming all of the communities, I'm bloody stunned actually at how many they are. And to know that so many of them are now under threat. I'm glad to know though that I just had a couple of my nephews come back from Australia, from across the other side. They decided to get out of there, but they told us that some of the Aboriginal landowners are now starting to send the signal, if you close our communities, we're going to close your mines. That's going to have an unfortunate impact on the Māori community and the Māori economy, given how many of Moki's relations are over there working in the mines. But be that as it may, whatever steps can be taken by any of us, anywhere in the world, to support the right of Aboriginal people to live in their own communities and still receive the same benefits that any other taxpayer in Australia gets, then we got to be out there and we got to be doing it. So me mihi atu kia koutou katoa ko tau mai i tēnei rā, hei tautoko i te kaupapa o te iwi moe a, kei tērā taha, o ngā iwi Māori i tēnei taha, o ngā iwi take puta noa te ao. As long as we all stand together and send a signal of solidarity, it's not even whether we win this one or don't win this one today. It's about sending a signal that this is going to grow, this strength is going to increase until such time as people genuinely understand that, particularly in Australia, where people, I struggle to think of anybody that I've seen treated so badly as I do our Aboriginal brothers and sisters in Australia. And I've been over there heaps of times. I was just over there last week in Canberra, and I got a chance to call down to the Aboriginal Embassy and just to talk to some of them who were gathering at the time. Same sort of thing, but different kaupapa. Of course, Anzac, of course, is going on right now, and they were over there, and their aim during Anzac Week was to raise the issue of all of their people who had died in the wars to defend the land, their own homelands in Australia. And for Australians not to think that the only thing worth celebrating and commemorating is all of the Australians, including black guys, who have died across in France and in Belgium and in those countries, Gallipoli, all of those places 100 years ago for some other capitalist prick's war. But to realise that people are dying and have been dying in Australia ever since, and particularly because those black diggers who went away to the First World War and went away to the Second World War came back to Australia and still didn't even have the right to vote, for God's sake. Didn't even have the right to vote. And so, I know of at least 2 Aboriginals who, when they were overseas in the Second World War, ran into the Māori battalion and deserted their companies in the Australian Army and hooked up with the Māori battalion because at least they felt comfortable hanging out with people that they knew. So we have an obligation not just to our kaupapa overseas, but to realising the importance of the stand that Indigenous people take to hang on to those lands, to keep the mining giants out. If that Western Australian economy is going to fail because China's decided not to buy any more iron ore, well, that's bad luck for Western Australia. But that doesn't give them the right to then boot every Aboriginal off his own land through some kind of lifestyle choice policy so that they can let the mining giants in to maximise the dollar for the Western Australian economy. So thank you all for turning up today. Thank you all for marching. For those of you who are public servants who aren't wearing scarves and pulling down balaclavas, be careful that you've still got a job tomorrow. Oh, and one other thing, one of the brothers has just come back from across Western Australia, and he's going to speak when we get up to Parliament. I won't mention his name unless he doesn't get up to speak at Parliament, in which case I will.
So we're going to do a few more chants. Everybody come close, just so we can ensure that they hear you.
The Australian High Commission would like to see your faces so they can have accurate pictures.